You're listening to KZSC's Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcón. Today I'm here with Dr. Sujatha Fernandes, Professor of Political Economy and Sociology at the University of Sydney and a visiting scholar at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. Her research combines social theory and political economy with in-depth, engaged ethnography of global social movements. She's a very prolific writer, writing books on Cuba, Venezuela, and hip-hop. Her latest book is titled Curated Stories, The Uses and Misuses of Storytelling, published in 2017 by Oxford University Press. This book looks at how the restructuring of personal stories as easily digestible sound bites has been an obstacle to building deeper movements for social change in the U.S. and globally. Dr. Fernandez's work has also been in popular forums, including the New York Times, The Nation, The Huffington Post, and Color Lines. And her work has been reprinted in several languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, German, French, and Chinese. I've invited her to talk about her work, including her latest book, Curated Stories, The Uses and Misuses of Storytelling. Welcome, Sujatha, to KZSC's Voces, Críticas.
Thank you, and thanks so much for having me on.
It's really quite a delight to have you on the show. So why don't we just start off with, why did you want to write this story? Why did you want to write Curated Stories?
It goes back to the work that I had been doing with the domestic workers movement in New York. I had been aware of the work being done by this organization for many years, and I was really impressed with the ways that they use stories in their campaigns for legislative rights to just make people aware of their situation, to humanize them. And originally I thought I was going to write a book about how social movements use storytelling to kind of build movements, to build power, and to help promote their issue. That was originally the idea that I had of the book. But what happened was in the aftermath of the campaign, when I went to interview the workers, they didn't want to tell their stories anymore, and they were very critical of the way that their stories had been used in the campaign. And so then that kind of got me thinking about, what does this mean? What happened to this campaign that was so kind of vibrant? Why were they so critical of how their stories were used? In addition to studying the domestic workers, I started looking at other examples. So I started looking at the undocumented student dreamer movement in the US. And then I was also looking at the example of a website of Afghan women telling their stories and trying to think more broadly about what is storytelling doing here? Why is it that we live in this era where so many causes and social movements and people from states to NGOs to nonprofits are engaging in this kind of storytelling? And what does it mean? Why now? And, what's happening? And so that was kind of how the book came about, because then I saw a lot of parallels across these cases. I saw the ways in which often these people are presented as voiceless, as in the shadows, and yet none of these people are ever voiceless. What I was looking at was how, in fact, that's a construction that means that some voices get privileged over others, and the voices that were getting privileged were the voices that were often, those handpicked with a particular biography that fit the acceptable narrative, and then their stories were kind of fit into these cookie-cutter kind of 5-minute narratives that were used and deployed in a range of different areas.
And so your work also is telling us how a deeper analysis of structures, of institutions, and of those kinds of inequalities become buried for the quick soundbite. And I wondered, is it possible for social movements to use storytelling for more radical purposes?
Yeah, and that's really my interest, right? This is why I wanted to write the book. And even though I'm studying these curated stories, I am interested to think about how might a deeper, more complex and contextualized storytelling be possible. And so I think, if we go back to the period of the 1960s and 70s, we see globally a whole lot of ways in which during the era of radical social movements, these kinds of in-depth stories were used in the women's movement. They were used in the Latin American testimonios or testimonies by guerrilla fighters and indigenous leaders and people to tell their story to help garner support for their cause outside. And we see in the farm workers movement, we see in the Black Power movement, all kinds of movements were using storytelling in ways that pointed to broader conditions of patriarchy, broader global conditions of exploitation, systemic oppression, that really linked the individual and the personal with the collective and the global in powerful ways. As well, in the aftermath of these campaigns I've been looking at, so after the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights campaign, after the early Dreamer movement, which was mainly controlled by mainstream immigration rights organizations, we begin to see a certain rebellion by those telling their stories, who are typically those within the movements who are those who are the most oppressed or the most affected. They begin to take control over their own narrative again and either say, I'm not going to tell my story, or to try to find other ways of doing it. And most of those means have been fairly creative means, like creative writing, poetry, video storytelling, that kind of thing.
And so one of the things that I was thinking about, too, in this desire to no longer tell the story, right, because there must be a level of exhaustion of having to repeat to different audiences. And the audiences, what they're hearing and what they're able to sort of receive in that story can be misconstrued. When we think about the domestic workers union movement that you wrote about in your book, what could have been or should have been maybe done differently if there was a redo? What kinds of redos should have happened there?
You're really right about the ways that this kind of exhaustion. So, for instance, with the Dreamer movement, people were saying, I'm so tired of going over and over to the media. My name is blah, blah. I'm a valedictorian. I graduated at the top of my class. And repeating these things over and over, there was really, I think, a very weary tone about this. With the organization Domestic Workers United, I think there's kind of two lessons, several lessons that come from this, but two in particular stand out. And one is the question of leadership by those most affected. What happened with the domestic workers movement, while it was founded by two domestic workers and one non-domestic worker, gradually over time, the domestic workers themselves became the storytellers, right? They were relegated to that role of cultural performance, of telling their story, and they were more and more excluded from issues of strategy, of coming up and designing strategy, which was left more to the sort of non-domestic worker middle-class leadership. And I think that's the problem. I was just actually at a storytelling conference at Lehigh College in Pennsylvania, where there was an organization called Redemption Project, which works with people in prisons. And what they were saying was that things like the narratives and the critiques of, say, for instance, parole without life were all coming from leaderships from people who were on the inside. And they were the ones driving the reformulation of that to call it death by incarceration. And that was really inspiring to me because they said, people on the outside were kind of taking their lead and were, trying to build support for the movement, but we weren't coming up with the frames, the narratives. That was really being led by those most affected. And that's what I think all of these groups are pushing for. They're saying leadership has to come from these groups. But instead what happens is the leadership comes from the nonprofits and the foundations who are really the ones giving the money and giving a lot of money in some cases to come up with what they think should be the priorities. And in the case of the domestic workers, nonprofits wanted to fund legislative work. So they're the ones ostensibly making the decision to fund legislative work. Now, the domestic workers from the beginning said, yes, we do think that, domestic workers need protections and we need to fight for these protections through the legislative system. But that is only one tactic in what should be a much broader movement that involves continual movement building, that involves, actually building an organization and promoting our organization. It involves a lot of different things. And what happened was over time, all of those other elements of movement building got slowly edged out to the point where all they were doing was storytelling advocacy, right? They were only just doing the legislative work. And so who's making those decisions? Often it is, the foundations. And so then I think the other lesson as well is the ways in which funding and the whole foundation regime kind of exercises control over what people do. And so one of the things that these organizations have begun to say is, how can we come up with a kind of funding that is a combination of some maybe small foundations and progressive foundations that, are in alliance with the kind of things we want to do with self-funding? That's been something a lot of groups have been talking about. Let's have fundraisers. Let's think about what resources we need. Do we necessarily need all these full-time staff? Can we have volunteers and part-time staff? And can we lower the requirements of what we need? And so there are all these questions because often foundation funding builds massive organizations with huge overhead and big, highly paid administrators and all the rest of it. And the question I think some of these groups are asking is, do we really need all that?
Well, and I think that point about funders is really critical for us to think about how that has now become its own market. When we think about the ways in which stories are used to or intended to humanize people, right? Humanize people from communities that have long been exploited and degraded, and in many ways to garner empathy that has not been shown to so many of these communities. And yet at the same time, these stories can cause a particular harm because they're focused on an individual narrative, and they're focused on narratives in some cases of super exploitation, right? As if abuse happens somehow in isolation. And so how can activists or advocates engage in storytelling as this political tool without forgoing the context that allowed that exploitation to thrive in the first place? Is it just about thinking multi-strategy? Is it just about thinking the multiple movements that actually need to be built in order to sustain radical change?
I think it is possible to do that kind of storytelling. And we look back at, say, the consciousness-raising storytelling of the women's movement. What they would do is they would tell the story about their personal experiences of patriarchy, but then they would link that to a broader condition, right? Which is why they're in movement together, because that's what sort of brings them together. That shared structure is something that they point to. And then, of course, to the movement for social change. And so they're connecting these different dots. And this is the difference, I think, between that earlier movement storytelling and the storytelling of the legislatures and other places today, where it's very truncated. You're not allowed to talk about the external conditions. You have to only address very specific benefits and pay and, the specific conditions of your job and your individual employer. And so everything becomes about this individual bad employer, this individual bad spouse, this individual bad parent, rather than a broader system of the care industry, patriarchy, and class, gender, race. All of these things fall out of the picture.
And then in contrast, when we think about the dreamers, we have the superhuman narrative, this person that conquers all against all odds. Look at this triumphant person. And so what concerns are you having now about the ways in which the tropes that get invoked as part of the dreamer's narrative, as part of the dreamer's cause, these are innocent young people with no choice. It's really the parents who are at fault. These are the good immigrants. These are the ones we want. Look how hardworking they are. Maybe if we could talk through a little bit about some of your concerns about how the dreamer's narrative has taken shape.
And this is the issue that the whole dreamer movement, the concept of the dreamer itself, was something that was devised by mainstream immigration organizations. And then to sort of fit that narrative of the high-achieving, upwardly mobile, as they put it, the best of the brightest, the face of the immigrant rights movement, they wanted to put a face to the world that would show this is what we look like. We want inclusion in America and we deserve inclusion in America, right? So the good immigrant is also the deserving immigrant, the one who is there by no fault of their own. And so at the beginning of the movement, what happened was that these people were handpicked, young people handpicked by immigration organizations who were valedictorians, who could display all of the qualities and who would be publicly willing to denounce their parents. And so you saw, quite sadly, in a lot of these early testimonies, people saying, my parents broke the law, but I am innocent, instead of what gladly we see today, which is people talking about their parents' struggle and identifying with their parents' struggle. But in that early time, that's who was handpicked by these immigration organizations. What did it mean? It meant that, anybody who was not high achieving, anybody who did not see America as their homeland and had ties to their home country, wanted to return to their home country, anybody who may have had gang involvement, anybody who was politically involved, all of those people were effectively erased from the narrative. And what was created was a narrative of these good and aspiring immigrants that we want to be part of America.
Well, it's the good aspiring immigrant that will not be a burden on taxpayers. That I thought was also a very, very pronounced trope, unlike their parents.
Right. And when Trump made the decision that he was going to be phasing out DACA, in defense of the dreamers from all kinds of quarters of society, this is again what we saw. Dreamers contribute this much to the economy. Dreamers are helping us in this way. And they're seen in these very economistic terms as simply valued for their labor productivity. And questions of social justice, valuing them as human beings, all these other questions kind of drop out of the picture. And the domestic workers are the same. I mean, a lot of the campaigns just emphasized how much they contribute to the New York City economy.
It said something to me about the lack of political imagination in some ways and a lack of political will, that this narrative does not have to be at the expense of someone else.
Right.
And especially, what strikes me about the dreamers narrative in particular was the parents are demonized in such a way as if movement or forced migration was even a choice.
That's right. Yes.
And you hear this a lot from the Central American students, right, who are talking about how their parents were displaced because of U.S. foreign policies.
Yes.
All of that gets completely erased.
Right. There's absolutely no sense of why people make the moves that they do. It doesn't matter, right? And it's interesting because a lot of the people who are handpicked for these early dreamer movements come from, say, communist-controlled Vietnam or communist-controlled North Korea, or they come from places that are seen as beacons of unfreedom and compared to the freedom of the United States. And this as well is a kind of ideological trope that somehow a movement from unfreedom to freedom, and they're the only things we see. We don't see, for instance, the stories of a lot of Latin American migrants who come because of problems of violence and other things caused by U.S. intervention, and that double movement, that often the reasons that people are coming here are reasons, whether it's economic structural reasons or political interventions caused by the global and the United States economy.
It's very convenient how that narrative or that part of the story gets dropped, isn't
Right,
it?
yes.
Very, very convenient how that works. You're listening to Dr. Sujatha Fernandes, is professor of political economy and sociology at the University of Sydney and a visiting scholar at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at CUNY Graduate Center in New York. She's the author of Curated Stories, The Uses and Misuses of Storytelling, published in 2017 by Oxford University Press. Well, I can't have you here and not talk a little bit about Latin America, given your own work in that area. And I know a lot is happening and lots of influx, but I would like to hear kind of briefly maybe your reaction to the latest news coming out of Cuba with Raul Castro stepping aside as Cuban president.
You know, I was there last in November and there was a lot of talk. People were sort of, very engaged in talking about this pending transfer of power. And I think, it's really interesting in some ways because this is the first leader to be born after the revolution. So far, the Castro brothers represent this very historic kind of leadership who were participants in the guerrilla struggle against the Batista dictatorship. And now we've come into a new era. And Miguel Díaz-Canel has been very clear that he doesn't intend to, have any kind of radical departure or shift from the policies of Raul Castro, but that rather he intends to sort of take them forward into a new era while the kinds of things that need to be adjusted and adapted as Cuba moves forward in a particularly difficult era will happen. It's interesting just bringing up Cuba in the context of storytelling because when I was there in November, one of the things that I was really fascinated by is all the new storytelling projects in Cuba. And I think here we can also see, if we're thinking, we talked earlier about the kinds of alternative storytelling projects. And one of the things that I saw, and I wrote an article about it in Cuba, is a storytelling project of young people, 8 to 10-year-olds, actually, children who were making documentaries. And in this one rural town in the region of Pinar del Rio, which is a rural area in the west of Cuba, and it was a small town that was very dependent on this one factory, a condiments factory, for its existence. When these young people were starting to make this film, the reason they were starting to make this film was because it was said that the factory was going to be shut down because of environmental contamination. And the environmental contamination was real. There was massive health problems being caused by the fuel being emitted. It was all this old Soviet technology that had just not been replaced in decades. But the young people also realized that this was the main source of income for their parents, for their grandparents, and that without it, the economy of the town that would become completely depressed. And so they made a documentary in which they interviewed their parents, they interviewed their grandparents, they told the whole history of the factory right from when the factory was founded in the 1940s to its takeover under the revolution and then its collective management by local people and right up until present times. And they showed in detail the kind of environmental contamination and said, we don't need to get rid of this factory, we need to remodel it so that it doesn't have pollution. To me, it was a really important example of this kind of profound storytelling where they're telling their own story. They're giving it to us in the voice of the local community who are concerned about this and who know that history. And they're telling the story through the stories of their parents and grandparents. And the wonderful thing was that this factory remained open as a result of their film. So it got to be remodeled. And when I visited there, it was operating again and nobody lost their jobs. And yet there was no pollution, so nobody's health was being affected. And that's a sort of example to me of a story that can have impact, that can actually make a change because of its ability to communicate in a heartfelt way, really, what struggle the people are going through, what the factory has meant in their lives to themselves, to the revolution, to their community and town, and as a result, bring about change.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, what about this relationship Cuba has with Venezuela, the other site that you've also done quite a bit of research? What is your assessment of the Cuban-Venezuelan alliance today? How is it going to become solidified with this transition in leadership? And Maduro's, all over the news right now, being charged with corruption. So what is your sense about what's happening right now with this alliance, as well as the politics of what's happening right now in Venezuela?
Yeah, it's a very difficult moment, I think, right now in Venezuela. It's hard because we can't really take what the mainstream media gives us. When I talk to friends in Venezuela, barrios, and they say, yes, things are difficult, but we're still managing, we're still surviving. There's not massive uprisings against the government on the streets. So it's a society that's kind of just holding it together day by day, but it's also a society facing a sort of tremendous economic crisis, under tremendous pressure from the continuing polarization, violence, everything that's happening. I think for many years, Venezuela provided a very very strong partner to Cuba, especially, given the ongoing struggle after the collapse of the Soviet Union for Cuba to find trade and the ongoing embargo for Cuba to find trading partners. Venezuela kind of filled that gap in a very crucial way that now, given its own economic crisis, regardless of the diplomatic relations, which I'm sure will continue with the new Cuban leader and with Maduro, but nevertheless, it's a relationship that isn't actually able to provide as much in actual material goods as it did in the past. And I know that Cuba has turned more and more to China and is sort of seeking to diversify to find other fountains of income and support. But it's a very hard time for Cuba as well, because with that loss of Venezuelan oil, it's really forced into more of a difficult position.
And the last thing I wanted listeners to learn a little bit about is about your fiction books for children. Why did you want to write children's books? And where did you get your inspiration to write the story, Don't Throw My Teeth in the Roof?
I wrote this story sort of based on a short story I had written when I was younger. We used to visit every year or every other year to my grandparents in India. And during one visit, my grandmother, she didn't speak any English. She was very foreign to me in that way. And, I didn't really understand much. And we would go to India. And one year when we went, I lost my 2 front teeth. And that was the pinnacle of excitement for me, because I was looking forward to what the tooth fairy would bring me. And I was so excited. And I ran to show my grandmother. And she took my teeth and went outside and threw them on the roof. And I was absolutely shocked. First I thought she was joking, and then when I realized she wasn't, I started screaming my head off till my parents came running and everybody saying, what's going on? And then it was explained to me that in India, in our particular culture, which is Mangalorean Konkani culture, the south of India, they believe that by throwing your teeth on the roof, if a sparrow comes and finds them, then that means that your new teeth will come sooner. It's just a cultural tradition of that area. And so I kind of used that example as a way of really thinking about the question of bonding. How do the children of migrants who live in different countries to their grandparents who don't speak the same language, how do they actually bond with them over those kind of boundaries of distance, of language, of culture? And so in the story, the little girl ends up bonding with her grandmother.
So academics, you don't have to just write scholarly books. You can also write children's books. Well, thank you so much for spending some time with us on Voces Críticas today.
Thank you so much for having me here.